You're listening to the Red Shed Tapes, and I'm your host, Shannon McMenamin. This episode is about objects, both big and small, as in the physical things inside our pubs and hotels. Cool old stuff. You might find relics from the Prohibition era alongside newer pieces, all bathed in warm lighting and earthy wood finishes. It's cozy and nostalgic, like a funky artist retreat inspired by history. Pieces are carefully chosen, and you never know what you're going to find. Like the other day,
Trying to find this one thing.
McMenamins historian Elysia Scholl shared a new discovery, an item connected to one of our venues.
So a woman named Lucille, who's 103 years old, said that when her mother, who was born in 1900, moved to Portland, the very first thing she did was to go sign up for dance lessons at Ringler's Dancing Academy, which is now Crystal Ballroom. And so we have that punch card. The card is signed 1919 by Montrose Ringler himself. And that was just a really sweet connection.
Some people may think it's just a piece of paper till they hear the backstory.
Yeah, history can feel so abstract and almost like a fairy tale. So to have an actual physical object that holds over 100 years of history, it just makes it so real.
Each object at McMenamins has its own unique story. Today we'll share a few of those stories and answer a question we get a lot. Where does McMenamins get all this stuff? In this episode of the Red Shed Tapes, we'll learn about the objects you see in McMenamins pubs, restaurants, and hotels. And along the way, meet Hank and Frank, two antique dealers who for years have sourced many of the objects that make up McMenamins' eclectic decor. And we'll wrap up the episode with a remembrance of the historic Portland Hotel, the source of some of our most treasured objects. And that includes some amazing back bars. Grab a pint and settle in. Starting out in the 70s, before we opened the first McMenamins pub, my dad Mike and Uncle Brian didn't have a lot of money to decorate. And besides, they didn't want anything too new or too snooty, as my dad put it. They were on the hunt for objects with a bit of weight to them, if not physically, then historically. And it just so happened the 70s were a good time to be into old stuff. Here's my dad.
I think we were lucky when we came up and did our first pub. It was a time when they were tearing down a lot of buildings still in Portland and could go in there and essentially glean what you could out of them. And that was the cheap way to go. We just go into a building and grab the marble or the old bars or cabinetry or light fixtures and try to rewire them ourselves and try to piece together bar tops or walls or old fixtures, cabinetry, and put it back together and maybe try to build in a little leaded glass. It was pretty crude, not a pretty carpentry job. But it was a lot of fun, and it was nice to be able to reuse something because that stuff brings so much history with it and so much power and its own energy and quality. And then you have to follow it up with quality stuff. It makes you up your game.
As we opened more pubs and restaurants, we needed seating, tables, bars, signs, and everything else. Luckily, my dad and Brian had a knack for finding like-minded collectors with an appreciation for quality, well-made, old stuff. It's those people behind the scenes, many my dad met 40 years ago, we're still working with today.
We knew all the folks. Hippo was just starting then, and Hank and Frank and all those guys, you know, they were beginning, so we all kind of began together. And so
he's talking about Hippo Hardware, a sprawling and impressive emporium of light fixtures and house parts from across the decades, located in the heart of Portland, Oregon. Hank and Frank? You'll learn more about them in a minute.
And then once we got to know each other, and then they would start asking us, what do you need in the future? What do you think you need? And you kind of go, well, we have the usual suspects with the classic metal signs. Pub tables, all kinds of paneling, you know, all the pub paneling, leaded glass windows, rugs, and all kinds of little subsets of nutty stuff. Well, you want to keep working with those people because it's fun. and you learn. And I learned so much.
In our first act, we meet Hank Langfus, a retired antiques dealer who spent decades traveling in Europe. My dad began working with Hank in 1985 when he and Brian opened the Mission Theater. They continued working with him until they opened the Elks Temple in 2019, before he retired. Hank has sourced some of our most iconic artifacts: the multicolored Italian chandeliers at the Crystal Ballroom and the white dragon sculpture that greets you at our McMenamins on the Columbia pub. But in the beginning, Hank helped my dad and Uncle Brian source objects from English pubs.
My wife and I, Mary Alice and I, we took a trip to England, and we just spent all of our time in the pubs over there checking out how they did stuff. Because British pubs, certainly at that point in time, that's 50 years ago or whatever, really had a great feel. And, over here at the time, it was pretty much everything was blacked out and you didn't go in there. It was not safe.
They liked that the pubs were gathering places for the whole family, which was in stark contrast to the dark, smoky bar culture back home. In order to recreate those types of spaces, they needed European things, and that's what Hank collected. I remember visiting Hank's store with my dad when I was a little girl. The showroom floor was a wonderful, opulent world of chairs, couches, lighting, and fully set tables. This time, we meet up with Hank at his house, which is also chock full of antiques.
This is just beautiful.
That's Korean.
It's beautiful.
We're in Hank's living room. The walls are almost completely covered with paintings and carvings. There are large wooden display cabinets filled with porcelain objects. And we're trying hard not to knock anything over.
Sorry, guys. Let me just look these past you a second.
Okay. The decor is densely layered and carefully curated.
This is two different things. So this bottom part is a French log box, probably from about 1860.
Okay, and then you put a tray like
I had this tray. It's from the Middle East, and it's inlaid with, I think, gold and copper and silver. Gorgeous. And it just happened to fit perfectly.
Hank retired from the antique business a few years ago, but he remembers his early days clearly.
At that time, I had formed a business called Portland Antique Company with my late business partner named Matt, who was actually from Hungary. He was in Budapest. And one thing he would say is, we're not antique dealers, we're world recyclers. Because a lot of the stuff we got, the bulk of the stuff we bought, was stuff from the 1920s and 30s, the stuff that the Europeans didn't want anymore, but it was novel here, and that's why it sold.
Can you tell the story of how you got started in the antique business?
It's a total coincidence. My parents were immigrants. When we could afford new furniture, my mom kept the plastic covers on the couches. We had very little in those days, but when I went to college, I met a woman who became my first wife, and her parents, they came over from Great Britain, and the house was full of beautiful antiques. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. So a couple of years later, went over to England in '74 to visit all our family over there, bought antiques for our home, met people in the antique business. And I just loved the English countryside so much, and I loved the antiques so much, that I went over and bought my first container loads for resale. And then for a few years, I just wholesaled to dealers and auction houses, and then I opened my first retail store.
Around what time do you remember meeting my dad?
How could I forget? When I met your dad, he had a long red beard.
Yep, it was before it went all white.
Now it's all white. And one day, Mike, Brian, and your grandfather walked in, and they were doing the Mission Theater.
My dad and uncle handpicked every piece of furniture, every piece hanging from the ceiling or adorning the walls.
And they walked around and they bought a few things for Mission Theater. And one thing I remember that I thought was really fascinating that they bought was and it may still be there, was a statue of Jack Dempsey, the boxer, the famous boxer. And that's how it started. Fairly quickly became just Mike who did the buying. And I remember them buying the metal signs for all the places.
How did you find these signs?
In England, I got involved with a fellow in a sign club. And what would happen is he was with all these people from all over Europe, who collected signs, and they all wanted perfect signs. So if they had a sign and found a perfect one, they wanted to get rid of the one that wasn't perfect.
Well, we like the non-perfect ones, so that works out
Exactly.
really well for us.
Exactly, that was the whole point. They liked the ones that had a little banging, a little rust, and things like that. That's one thing I really enjoyed about buying things for the McMenamins. And Mike really liked the unusual signs, because he didn't want Coca-Cola signs or Chevrolet signs. They had to be things that were different. I tended to buy whatever I thought was interesting looking, and I found out very rapidly that Mike liked signs that had a lot of blue in them, and didn't like signs that had a lot of green in them.
So listeners, these porcelain metal signs Hank had access to, they're dispersed around our properties. For example, there's a pair of vintage signs for Palethorpe sausages, and no surprise, they have a blue background. One lives at Edgefield's Power Station Pub, and its twin at East 19th Street Pub in Eugene, Oregon.
Some of those signs
Really big
now, when they started buying them, they weren't all that expensive. Now they're highly collectible. It didn't take me long to understand that he had a look that he had in his mind. Mm-hmm. And he bought things that he already, I could tell, because I've had it with other people.
Yeah.
He already knew the feel he wanted to create.
Yeah.
So it was a matter of finding it.
So what other looks did my dad have in mind?
He was into sort of Asian mysticism.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So Asian things, Buddhist things, mystical things.
Things that have significance, and power.
One time I had a Chinese Buddha statue that was about 3.5, 4 feet tall. Mm-hmm. And Mike bought it, and he strapped it in his car. He was driving like a Explorer-type vehicle. I think he drove around town with it as his passenger for months. He also liked the arts and crafts movement, and that was another sort of style I could find things.
For listeners, the arts and crafts movement came about in mid-19th century Britain. It emphasized handmade, high-quality materials instead of machine or factory production. You can find an ornate arts and crafts style antique back bar in Maddie's room at Hotel Oregon.
And, so there are certain looks that either went together or maybe not necessarily one would have thought they would go together, but he had the ability to put them together. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of the magic of it all.
So my dad was collecting items the whole time, whether he'd use them right away or not. And when we'd open a pub, he'd pull from that collection.
You find as many vintage pieces as you can, because they all have soul, and you throw them together, and then you keep adding or subtracting or whatever until it seems to make sense.
That's the formula for designing our locations. And the crazy part is that somehow along the way, it became a style. You can still tell you're at a McMenamins by the way it feels. Even at a very young age, my son could always identify one of our locations just by walking in. He was probably all of 3 years old, and he'd be like, "Oh, this is one of our pubs." I never knew Hank's first business partner. When I met Hank, he was with his second partner, Frank, who originally sold antiques in England.
I get a phone call from Frank, says, "Remember me?" I said, "Yeah, I remember you." He says, "My wife got a job in Portland. I'm coming out."
So now in Act 2, we meet Frank Coates, an antique dealer who sold items to Hank for about 10 years while living in England. They went into business together and became the iconic duo Hank and Frank, a fixture in McMenamins lore. We have a photo of them hanging in the restaurant at our Elks Temple.
My father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather were all involved in the antiques trade, and fine art trade.
Frank's the owner of Bloomsbury Fine Art and Antiques. When we met up at his Southeast Portland showroom, he had just seen my brother Dan, who had come by to pick up a few things.
And that's a wonderful thing where you can see the next generation of a family and of a business that have maybe a different view and a different slant upon how to decorate. And I know that Dan, for example, is really keen on ethnographic stuff like tribal masks and carvings and stuff like that. He's even looked at some mid-century lighting, much to your father's horror.
Oh, I know.
I mean, so...
That's so funny to me.
I had known of the McMenamin family when I was in England, even before I had moved to Portland, Oregon. Before we created Bloomsbury, I was trading under my own name, and Hank Langfus of the Portland Antique Company, he had come and purchased items from me and many other old sort of timey dealers that no longer exist. They're either retired or no longer with us. Hank was probably like the biggest antique dealer in town for significantly longer than I, because he's much older than I am. And I arrived here in the late 90s and 98. I sort of carried on with what we were doing before.
Can you describe meeting my dad for the first time and what your impressions were?
Actually, it's engraved in my memory. I had this old steel warehouse down off of Interstate Avenue on Albina, which was next to the Savoy Glassworks, who were a great glass company here in town. And we had a wonderful back bar that had come from the old Portland Hotel, which is now Pioneer Square, Portland's living room, as they used to call it.
Pioneer Square is Portland's living room. It's a happening hub, a city block turned gathering spot for many of the best events happening downtown. And it's the same site where the former Portland Hotel was built and then demolished. We'll have more on the hotel later in the episode.
So when the building was knocked down, this back bar was salvaged, and it was by a company called Brunswick, who were very famous. We had also just come back from Italy, and we had bought an inglenook, which was from an old Roman bathhouse.
I think I know where that is.
Do you know where that is?
It's at Edgefield.
It is at Edgefield, that's right.
Yep.
So your dad came in knowing exactly what he wanted, which wasn't a bar and an inglenook that day. But once he'd seen them, he knew that they had to be purchased. And I knew from that minute that your dad had a real eye for preservation and a real eye for, gilding buildings that were already, objects of beauty, and putting things in there that really made them a feast for the eyes.
So you had just gotten in from the UK, pretty much. And around that time, my mom and dad would have been traveling around Europe and were drawn to that British pub culture. Do you remember talking to my dad about Europe?
We spoke about the culture in England and how it was very much identifying with a local, where people would go. And we had spoken a few times about great pubs and restaurants that we had purchased things from. Over the last sort of 25 years too, the demographic in England has changed. The way that people live has changed slightly, and a lot of pubs and restaurants closed down. And so what, your father saw in England, that wonderful pub culture, the open fireplace, the open hearth, the warm wood on the walls, the great seating and cast iron tables. I mean, they came here. I think that he was very keen to sort of replicate that idea in places that you have here in Oregon.
As McMenamins grew, so did our interest in filling places with meaningful items. And we were looking for different things with a strong sense of place.
I think the engine that had driven the design, from my own knowledge of it, was basically, your father's vision and certainly probably your uncle too. So we were always very conscious that we would buy objects that would probably be of interest.
Frank has a trained eye and makes it his business to know quality.
I look at something and I say, does it show execution of ability, i.e. who made it? If you were a cabinet maker, does it show that you really knew what you were doing, that everything is dovetailed or doweled and pegged? Or if it's, a 16th century Tudor table, has it been properly made? And then secondly, does it have integrity of materials? Is it made from really great, solid quarter-sawn oak? Is the inlay that's in there, is it with fruitwoods and holly and wonderful exotic timbers? And then 3, is it pleasing to the eye? Particularly when you and your dad and Dan have been visiting and purchasing, you operate a similar idea that it's got to show that whoever made it had the good skill and craft, has integrity of materials. And most importantly, probably, is it pleasing to the eye?
In the antique shop he runs today, Frank has a staff of expert craftspeople. They specialize in various types of restoration.
This is Laura and Adam. Hello. Adam's French polishing. This wonderful big library table with turned legs
Yeah.
and putting a really nice finish on it.
We're walking around the Bloomsbury workshop. The staff is working intently on restoring light fixtures, rugs, and furniture. One of them is also named Frank.
My name is Frank McCorney, and I am the warehouse manager. And I am actually from Portland, Oregon. I'm one of the unicorns, as they're called. I refer to myself as the forensic furniture mechanic. So when something is broken or in a state of disrepair, I'm not just treating the symptom of it. I'm trying to figure out how did we get here, what was the original state of the piece, and then what might have happened to lead to it being in the state that it's in. A lot of things when they arrive here, we say they've lived a life. They have not necessarily been taken care of at all points in their life, and when they get to us, we try to make them better. We try to get them closer to how they originally were.
It makes me happy to see so many beautiful items being restored, and to see that so many high-level craftspeople specializing in restoration live right here in Portland. So what do you think the significance is of preserving antiques and keeping them alive?
So, I mean, in terms of our own business, if we speak about being green, about having a low carbon footprint, about making do and mending, there are some wonderful things that are not necessarily incredibly valuable, or they're not going to cost you a huge amount of money, that can be repurposed, that can be refurbished, that can have a whole new lease of life.
It reminds me of something Hank said about being world recyclers.
Many of the church pews, for example, that came from early 19th century churches, ironically, a lot of them were made of Doug fir and Oregon pine that had been shipped to England or Ireland, and then later on we brought them back home. And in a day and age where we're rebelling somewhat against consumerism, against single-use items, I hope that people can see the beauty in repurposing wonderful architectural elements, you know, antique period furniture, great artwork. You know, there have been some other things that we've sold to you that are incredibly rare things. All of these cast iron pub tables that come from lots of old 19th century pubs in England. We bought a lot of them in a city called Hull. It's a coastal town. And there was a local politician called William Wilberforce who had championed the emancipation of the slaves at least 20, 30 years, more than that, before America did. And we had bought a number of cast iron pub tables and just wonderful bits of architecture. And a few of them had the title Emancipation of the Slaves and the date on them. A couple of those tables, these great cast iron tables, are in your bars and restaurants somewhere. And I encourage anybody that listens to this podcast to go to every single McMenamins where you can buy a drink and eat very well for a reasonable amount of money. And look at all of the pub tables to see if you can see the writing on them, because it's a really incredibly rare. And I think that idea lives on in the object. And if we hadn't been able to purchase them, I could just see that a lot of the demolition companies, they would have ended up going into landfill. So we were able to go in before the bulldozers went in and have all these items removed, and we would purchase them. I think that is a really sincere form of recycling.
There were a lot of people who were doing that at the time. I know the term that I'd heard before is gleaners, who would go around and pull stuff out of these old buildings and houses before they would get demolished. In the same way that our business preserves history, I think that McMenamins have done the same thing in many of the bars and restaurants, particularly in the more historic buildings, that they have been treated with dignity and had items put in there that are contemporary or complementary to the building that houses them. Frank had been gathering salvaged treasures from historic buildings in the UK, and when he moved to Portland, he continued to find artifacts from buildings being demolished locally. And that brings us back to the Portland Hotel.
Really, we should rebuild the damn hotel, you know, because it was such a great thing. And not to say that, you know, and that's the square now, which is a lovely thing for downtown Portland, but this building was European look, castle-like thing. It was really cool, but a lot of stuff that was great went away in the 50s.
That brings us to Act 3. In my family, I heard the Portland Hotel mentioned a lot, but since it was demolished in the 50s, I had, of course, never seen it. So I had to go find out more about this Portland castle.
Hi. How you doing? Good. How are you?
That's how I met up with Norman Golston, the Preservation Program Manager at the Architectural Heritage Center. He's a Portland historian and has an extensive collection of artifacts from the Portland Hotel. He has 250 albums filled with hotel photos, menus, and postcards.
That's one of the dining rooms there.
Oh, yeah. Okay, these are the ones that we have in Hotel Oregon.
The sconces.
Yep, the sconces.
Cool, in McMinnville.
Yep. We're here today to talk a little bit about the Portland Hotel. And many people have never heard of the Portland Hotel.
Well, it came about because Portland was getting the railroad from back east, the Northern Pacific Railroad. Henry Villard was the financier, and he wanted a hotel that was worthy of big-time people to stay in Portland.
Tell me some details about the architecture.
The original investors, they hired McKim, Mead & White of New York, who had designed the most monumental things in the country at the time, like Penn Station and so forth. They call it chateau-esque style. It almost looks Germanic, even though it's kind of French chateau with the mansard roofs and everything, but it's got the stone and the brick and the stucco. So it almost looks like Bohemian a little bit, but it's on a big scale because it was 8 stories, 326 rooms.
It was big.
It was a grand hotel. And so on the West Coast, besides San Francisco, you weren't going to find a grand hotel. You know, we were still considered the frontier.
Right.
But then they get here and they go, oh my God, civilization.
Yeah.
Villard was very savvy and he was trying to draw money to the city. And so by having this big hotel and wining and dining investors, they would invest in the city and all the resources we had, all the timber and grain and fisheries, the canning, that was making this a very wealthy area. We had 11 presidents spend the night there.
I heard stories about a bar there that my grandpa may have gone to. Do you know anything about the bar?
Oh my God, of course there was a bar. The Rathskeller. Yes, no, it was a social place, you know, and then on every Sunday there's a big brunch where the ladies were dressed up in their finest and would eat to be seen. Anybody who's anybody would have Sunday brunch at the Portland Hotel.
So, I mean, it seems like it was really important to the city and its development, but why was it torn down?
Well, it's hard to fathom why they would tear it down because up until almost the day they demolished it, they were still serving Sunday brunch there. So it wasn't
like it was falling apart.
Right. No, they talk about it not having been maintained. You know, they make those hints like in the paper and that stuff, but it was, I think most of that was after it was already agreed that it was going to sell, that they just kind of stopped putting money into it because it was still a big deal up till the end. You know, it was out of style. We had the Benson Hotel, which was a little finer, a little more upscale, and the Imperial, and it was right downtown where the property was worth a lot, and Myron Frank was really itching to have its own parking.
So it was torn down for a parking lot for Myron
Or a
Frank.
2-story parking lot, which I remember when I was a kid, and it was the ugliest parking lot you ever saw.
Oh, it's so sad. It's so sad.
It was a real eyesore. But yeah, so that was the one big thing, like, how could that have ever be torn down? Because the car was now becoming this important thing, and it was drawing people into downtown. They could drive their car and go to work and live in the burbs because their offices and businesses were still downtown. All of a sudden, you've got all these surface lots where all these fine buildings used to be, and people are going, this is, you know, this isn't fair. It's ugly. You know?
Do you know if there were any efforts to save it at the time?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't reading articles about that period. It was that mid-century modern era, and people were tired of garishness and Victorianism, and even had come out of the craftsman era where they rebelled against that. It was now like mid-century modern, where everything should be, you know, clean and new and space age, and not this quaint grandma's hotel.
So the general public had just kind of moved on from that.
Yeah. And so nobody was really appreciating those old buildings at that point because it went down in 51. But once it was gone, that was really kind of the first big wake-up call.
Well, yeah.
Like, what are we, because in the 40s, they really started tearing things down. And so like-minded people started trying to collect the decorative pieces of those buildings, the stained glass windows, the other architectural elements that were fancy, and took a lot of craftsmanship that wasn't being done anymore. Some people at ground level were appreciative of those things, and that it kind of spurred a movement.
And that takes us back to gleaning.
And were some of the early guys who were really pushing for it, like Mike McMenamin, Steve Miller, and also our founders, Ben and Jerry. Even when they were kids, they were riding around on their bicycles to job sites and scrounging up pieces and riding it home on their handlebars.
Norman's talking about Ben Milligan and Jerry Bosco, preservationists who created the foundation behind the Architectural Heritage Center. And Steve Miller is another preservationist, a friend and a founder of Hippo Hardware. We're going to get into our long relationship with Hippo Hardware in a future episode. And of course, we can't talk about the Portland Hotel without a nod to the legendary gleaners, Lawrence and Dorothy Miller. They're the reason we have so many fixtures and architectural elements from the Portland Hotel in our places today. My dad explains.
The Miller family up by Kennedy School, who gleaned buildings in the 50s. They were getting older. They were both in their mid-90s. And they just wanted their stuff to be somewhere where the public could enjoy it. I think we got, 16 of these from the Portland Hotel. I mean, look at that fluted. These are 1880s. They were in a heap. Hippo was able to put them back together. They're very delicate. They had a flame on the top originally, and we've still got that. Spectacular work.
The fixtures from this collection can be found across our properties. We also have the portico iron gates, framing murals in the hallway at Kennedy School, stanchions you pass through to get to Pat's Corner at the Grand Lodge, and the Brunswick back bar that ended up in the Haynes Hall at Anderson School. Items like these create a connection between our locations and a link to the past. We didn't know it at the time, but along the way, as we gathered what was available and we tapped into something larger and more meaningful, it became intentional. So next time you find yourself admiring a vintage light fixture, an unusual painting, or a piece of old furniture, remember, these aren't just decorations. They're part of a story, carefully chosen to honor the past, while creating a sense of place that feels like home for everyone who walks through the door today. People know that about our company, which brings us back to something we talked about earlier, Brunswick bars. In 2016, we got a call from the owners of the Lotus Bar, an iconic downtown Old Portland institution that lived out its 9 decades as a saloon, lunch counter, illegal gambling parlor, movie set, and dance club. It was the first bar my Uncle Brian went to.
I was under 21, so I remember getting kicked out by the old gal behind the bar. She asked for my ID. Of course, I didn't have any fake ID. I got the bum's rush.
Yeah. After 92 years, the Lotus was calling it quits. Another historic building to be demolished, making way for new construction. My uncle remembers getting the call.
Yeah, we looked at it because we were fascinated with old bars, the history of places like that.
I'm talking with my uncle at the cavernous backstage bar behind the Baghdad Theater in Southeast Portland.
Yeah, I remember seeing the bar at Lotus. It's from the Brunswick catalog, which was the catalog of a lot of the wonderful bars that you see around the country, anywhere, actually. Pretty distinctive with the floral design and the pillars. They're classics. It's just one of those things that we really liked. Anything that spoke of history, had a story. It was always fun to build a pub around some of that stuff because you don't have to make the stuff up. It comes with it. The story's there for you. It's your job to unlock it and get it out there. And I would like to hope that our customers appreciate that extra piece too, because it brings it to life.
As fate would have it, we were presented with an opportunity to capture a piece of history from a building that was scheduled for demolition. At 30 feet long and 13 feet high, it was a perfect fit for the backstage bar.
The whole thing is just look at it. It's magnificent. We were very fortunate to be able to get our hands on this.
I can't even imagine trying to move this.
It was crooked and sagging a little bit and had a lot of issues.
As any good old bar should.
As any good old bar should. So, and it took a lot of work to rebuild it, way more than, We paid a fee to buy the bar. Ended up putting a whole bunch more into it just to get it so it could sit here.
It's a massive undertaking.
Well,
huh?
Of course. And, oh, yeah, we'll just take it down and put it up. And, yeah, well.
Super easy, right?
Yeah, we've been there, done that.
Yep, been there, done that. This isn't the first time we've been enamored with a piece that ended up needing a little love, or in this case, a lot of love, to be restored. Because while we're interested in beer and pubs, we're just as passionate about taking these objects that have already lived a life and continuing their story.
I think that's par for our course. Everything's going to be way more than it looks.
Always. Well, I think that's something too, like when people get into restoring old things and when they are like trying to repurpose stuff, it never quite goes the way you think it's going to go.
And you can't stop. You have to finish it and you have to make it right. And you owe it to the back bar. You owe it to bring it all back the way it should be. So I'd hate to sell it short by trying to cut corners. It's much more fun to have the real thing stared at you.
So why go to all the effort to preserve it?
Oh, gosh, it's just pass it on. You hate to see that old stuff die. And it's the history of Portland. I mean, we grew up here. We're in Washington, too, and love it. We really attach ourselves to the communities we're in. So it's nice to have representation of part of that community. So it's always been big for us to bring back memorabilia from bygone places.
You know, my dad and uncle have definitely passed that reverence for cool old stuff on to the next generation. And I can say for myself, the bars that I have frequented in my life, especially the bars from the 1800s and early 1900s, those were always my favorite. There's something about that style that has so much personality. And every time I visit those places, it's like seeing an old friend. And if that bar then moves to another location, you can still go and visit. We hope that's how our customers feel about our places. As my dad and uncle discovered back in the 70s, you never know what you're going to find and what that's going to mean for you later. So we're going to keep at it. Keep looking for the real stuff. That's a feast for the eyes that has a strong sense of gravity and connection. Before we wrap up, I just want to bring up the fact that there are so many people who have helped to curate the look of our locations. Artists, dealers, members of our community, and it's impossible to acknowledge everyone. But they're so important to our story, and we thank you all. I'm Shannon McMenamin. Thanks for listening to the Red Shed Tapes.
The Red Shed Tapes is produced by McMenamins, Gretchen Kilby, and Jess Linus at Jess is Creative. Sound editing by Gretchen Kilby. McMenamins' production team includes Kat Nyberg, Michelle Jake Robbins, and Renee Rank Ignacio. Our podcast theme music was composed by Jim Brunberg and Ben Landsverk at Wonderly. Additional music from Epidemic Sound and APM Music. Podcast artwork is by Lillian Ripley. Thanks to everyone who appeared in the episode: Hank Langfus, Frank Coates, the team at Bloomsbury Antiques, and Norm Golston, and to many others who provided tips, information, and the actual stuff that found its way into McMenamins pubs and hotels, especially the Miller family, who gleaned many beautiful objects from the Portland Hotel before its demolition. Extra gratitude to Norman Golston at the Architectural Heritage Center for sharing his boundless knowledge of Portland history and architecture, particularly the Portland Hotel, and for guiding us through the stacks of ephemera he has spent years collecting. Learn more about the Portland Hotel at OregonEncyclopedia.org. You can get in touch with us here at the Red Shed Tapes by emailing podcast@mcmenamins.com.